Okay, so just a little bit about what the project is. It's a whistle-stop tour through a very long and detailed project. The title is Research and Information on the Rural Water Sector. And there was a study that was commissioned by the department and the appointed TOBIN Consulting Engineers to prepare that. So it was 2 years of intensive work and summarised into 20 minutes today. So hopefully I've included most of the relevant material. While the study sounds quite academic, just from my own perspective, a little bit about my background. I grew up outside Tullamore, County Offaly, and my father, I suppose, was chairman of the local group water scheme and spent about 15 years trying to get the town supply extended out as a public group water scheme, which he did in the 1980s. So a lot of the committee meetings were held in our sitting room growing up. So I understand certainly throughout my life and my career the needs and the aspirations of the rural water sector. So just how we got to the start of the project. In 2017, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Future Funding of Domestic Water Services was formed, and that's the report that was prepared. Subsequent to that, in 2018, the Rural Water Working Group were tasked with conducting a review of the wider investment needs relating to rural water services. In April 2021, TOBIN were appointed by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage to undertake the study. And this year, in February 2023, the final reports were issued. So it's almost a 2-year programme. So just in terms of scope, there were 2 assignments in our study. First assignment was a literature review. As with any of these studies, it's important to go back and to see what the available literature tells you about the workings of, I suppose, a sector such as the rural water services sector. So that's the snapshot there of the final report that was produced from assignment 1. There was extensive consultation over roughly a 12-month period, and I'll talk about the consultees in a minute. Assignment 2 was the actual output report, was to develop a final output report with some conclusions for the working group, and that's a shot of the final report. And the scope included key aspects of the delivery of rural water services. Now, the term rural water services is very important because it's not just rural water, it's also wastewater. So it includes domestic wastewater treatment systems, including septic tanks. But a large part of the study was, of course, rural water supply. And it was all aspects of this. So it included supervision, funding, governance, and monitoring. It's a root and branch review of the sector. It's important to state that it was a gap analysis, so it wasn't part of our brief to come up with recommendations. We had to identify gaps in the sector and needs of the sector, report back to the working group, and the working group from that point develop the recommendations and amendments to the workings of the sector. So in terms of rural water services, what do we mean? Well, firstly, on the water side, these include private water supplies. The term private water supplies isn't used that much in Ireland. We're all used to the term group water schemes, but they are essentially private water supplies. And that includes all water supplies that provide water for human consumption, which are not operated by Irish Water. And appreciate Irish Water have since rebranded to Ishgéireann, but there's a few slides here where I use that term. On the wastewater side of things, it's private wastewater treatment systems. So these are domestic type wastewater treatment systems not operated by Irish Water. So your typical, I suppose, packaged treatment plants, septic tanks, all of that. In terms of the water side of things, all water supplies can be categorised as follows. They're either public or government based. So for example, Irish Water. Private and regulated, which is the model in England and Wales. They can be community based. So, for example, our own group water schemes, they're community-based schemes, or they can be household, so a private well. So all of these are classed as water supplies, and it covers public and private water supplies. That's just a little pie chart there of the percentage of the Irish population served by both private and public supplies. So the large light blue wedge that you can see, the 83.5%, That represents the percentage of the Irish population supplied by public water, so Irish water schemes essentially. So we're really talking about the remainder, the three smaller wedges. So back to that pie chart again. As I said, the focus of our study from the water side of things was the 16.6% of the Irish population that is served by private water supplies. And that includes public supplies, private supplies, and household wells. So the second largest wedge there, the slightly darker blue, the 10.4%, that's 10.4% of the Irish population that are on private wells, so household supplies. So really, I suppose, if you talk about the group water scheme sector, you're really talking about the red and the green here, which doesn't look that significant, but of course we all know it is significant. It represents a large chunk of rural Ireland and a very important part of water supply in the country. So how does the 16.6% compare to other countries? And that was part of our brief to look at international comparators. Well, in England, it's 1%. So that's a map of England and Wales there. Sorry, England, Wales has been cut off. So the comparative figure in England is 1% private. Now that's very obvious to anyone that has driven around England and realises how urban the population is in England. But it's a direct comparison. So even though the 16.6% looks like a low figure, compared to England is actually quite high. So some history just to take a step back. Okay, back to the 1950s, so 1955, and this was part of the literature review. It's important to look back to be able to understand where the sector came from. So in 1955, the government established, or a committee established rural water and sewage infrastructure. In 1957, there was a polio outbreak, which covered a lot of the country, in particular Cork. And you may not be able to make it out, but that's the iron lungs that were commonplace back in the 1950s to deal with polio. Anything in yellow here is a significant milestone in the history of the sector. So in 1959, the government's strategy for rural water was published. Over the course of the 60s, there was Turn on the Tap campaign, which was quite transformational, really, in rural water supplies in Ireland. But yet, by 1971, which is the year I came into existence, 58% of Irish households, only 58% of Irish households had a pipe supply. We all know the village pumps there. So in 1972, Ireland entered the EEC, which is now the EU. That was again a transformational moment because we had water quality objectives that were required for our farm produce as part of the EEC membership. Many group schemes were formed in the 1970s, 60s into the 70s. So moving on, over the course of the 80s, there were ongoing water quality issues, mainly from surface water sources, but not exclusively. So throughout the 1990s, I suppose those problems persisted. And in 1998, the first rural water programme was published. Subsequent to that, in 2002, there was a European Court of Justice case. It was a test case based on Ballycroy Group Water Scheme. And that really was, again, transformational. The ECJ case was centred around coliform compliance. So over the course of the 2000s, anyone that was involved in the sector knows that there was massive capital spend, including on the DBO bundles as we know them. And that's one example there. Some of you might know that photo, anyone involved in the scheme. Moving into the 2010s, as I said in the first slide, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on the Future Funding of Domestic Water Services was formed. But yet, all is not done. There's still a lot of work to do because, as we know, THMs are an ongoing problem. And there was an EU reasoned opinion on THM compliance against Ireland in 2020. So there's still a lot of work to do. I mentioned earlier on in terms of consultees, well, who did we speak to get the views of the sector? All of these local authorities were, I suppose, suggested to us to represent large, small, a heavy involvement in group water schemes, a lesser involvement. So we spoke to all of those over a few months. We spoke to all aspects of the HSE and the EPA. In consultation with the Federation, we selected 6 group water schemes to actually consult with. and they represented both private supplies, public group schemes, large and small groundwater, surface water. So we interviewed each of those, and obviously the federation themselves. And lastly, the DBO contractors. We selected 2 DBO contractors because they have an important role in the ongoing functioning of the sector. That's a graphic that we prepared to try and represent the structure of the sector in terms of water supply. Anything in green is a privately sourced group water scheme. The 3 bubbles, green bubbles there on the left, are publicly sourced group water schemes. The actual public supplies, the Irish water supplies, are in orange on the left-hand side. And out on the right-hand side, you have 2 subcategories. You have the wells, the household supplies, and you have small private supplies, which have a particular definition in legislation. Supervisory authority for private supplies are the local authorities, and for public supplies it's the EPA. And the EPA is actually the supervisory authority for the local authorities. So it's quite a complicated system, but we all know how it works. Just a quick note in terms of the drinking water regulations, the current drinking water regulations. Just one thing that's pulled out from that, the term exempted supply. Some of you will be familiar with exempted supply. It's also referred to as exempt supply or unregulated. So the definition of that is set out in the regulations. It doesn't mean that exempted supplies don't have to comply with water quality requirements. It just means that they're exempt from the monitoring and reporting requirements of the regulations, and that's an important point. We said we looked at international comparisons. So where do we look at? We looked at Scotland, Brittany, Galicia and Spain, Finland, Denmark, Austria. We looked at all of those geographies because these are geographies across Europe where there's somewhat comparable structure in terms of rural water. So England and Wales don't have it, but Scotland certainly does. They're not called group water schemes. A lot of them are called community water schemes, but it's the same principle. So in the literature review, we studied all of these geographies. 1 or 2 graphs just on trends. So again, going back to our pie chart, something that we all know is the trends that are shown on the right-hand side here. Firstly, the orange and the yellow bars, those bars represent the numbers of private group schemes and public group schemes from 2004 through to 2019, and you can all see a general decrease in the numbers of schemes. That's just literally the numbers that are reported. So that's a trend that we all know is continuing through amalgamation and rationalisation. The 2 lines on that graph is the percentage of the population supplied. So even though these schemes are amalgamating and they're being rationalised, notwithstanding that, the actual percentage of the population that's supplied by these schemes is actually dropping as well. Obviously Ireland is growing, it's becoming an increasingly urban society, so that has been represented, I suppose, in the percentage that are now supplied by group schemes. So that's the current trends, and they're likely to continue. In terms of water quality compliance, some of the things that we found, that's a very good graph in representing coliform compliance on public schemes, so Irish water schemes, which is the blue line, and on private schemes, which is the orange line. Somebody want to silence that phone? Thanks. So you can see from 2004 through to 2016, the sector, the group water scheme sector, there was significant improvements in terms of coliform compliance. And the gap was closed with the massive spending in the group water scheme sector right up to 2015. But that gap hasn't been fully closed, as you see. I've circled that in red. So there's still a water quality gap there. So while coliform compliance in public schemes is touching 100%, in private schemes it's a few percent off that. So there is still a water quality compliance gap, and that's proven difficult to close. A specific concern is VTEC. That's the long term for VTEC then. It's a version of E. coli. And you can see these are the VTEC cases in Ireland as reported by the HSE from 2004 up to 2020. And And you can see a significant increase in VTEC cases from around about 2012. So it's a striking graph. A lot of the VTEC cases are actually associated with the small private supplies. And the small private supplies are supplies that have a commercial aspect to them. So their particular definition in the legislation. So a typical one would be a creche in a remote area, we'll say outside an urban area not connected to the public mains, which has, for example, their own well. These are particularly vulnerable supplies, and you can see that now. I'm not saying every VTEC case in the country is associated with small private supplies, but it is a particular problem. In terms of expenditure, you'll all be familiar with the Rural Water Programme over the years. That graph represents the capital expenditure, which over 24 years since the first Rural Water Programme has amounted to over €1 billion. And you can see the peak in it around about 2006, 2007. That's directly associated with the expenditure on setting up the DBO bundles. Okay, that settled back from 2012 to the current time to a steady spend, and has actually increased in recent years. So it's not an inconsiderable amount. In terms of the annual subsidies, the graph has been upwards consistently, really. That's amounted to €250 million over 24 years. So part of our brief was to look at the level of expenditure and to comment on that. And I suppose our comment really is that it has served the needs of the sector well over the last 24 years. Just two quick slides on source type. This information is available on the Federation's website. So this particular graphic here represents the source type. So all of the purple dots are groundwater, all of the green dots are surface water. And when you compare that to the geology of the country, the type of rock, you can see obviously that the groundwater sources are largely centred in the limestone area, which is the blue. Thanks, Joe. So that's not surprising. In terms of the DBO schemes, the blue here represents DBO schemes and the orange non-DBO schemes. So you can see the geographical clustering of those in, say, the West and North Midlands, and a lot of you are involved in those schemes. Just a quick word on domestic wastewater treatment, which is the other side of the project. On the left-hand side here, that graphic shows how dispersed a rural population we have. So it's no surprising that we have the number of septic tanks that we have. On the right-hand side, that's a graphic across Europe showing the percentage of the population that's actually unsewered. So Ireland is at 30% unsewered, which is actually quite high in the European context. So again, these are legacy issues. It's proven difficult to deal with septic tanks and the legacy issues associated with that, but we have a lot of work to do because of our dispersed rural population in terms of the wastewater side. I won't dwell on these graphics, but these are in the report for anyone that's interested in it. This is a graphic showing the governance and regulation and how all of the entities in that structure interact with each other. That's one on the funding streams, showing the flow of money through the sector, including the subsidies, including the capital spend, all of that. Just in terms of key messages, the key messages are actually in the slide deck at the end for anyone that wants them. I'm not going to go through them here, but the output of the report was 48, I suppose, conclusions, and broken down into three elements. The blue ones being, I suppose, water related, the orange being domestic wastewater related, and the other three covering governance, funding and future challenges. So they're in the slide deck for anyone that wants them. But just to finish, I suppose, with a few footnotes, just to say that rural water services in Ireland are a product of our history, as I've demonstrated, and also a relatively dispersed rural population. We have come a long way since the 1950s, when piped water supplies only existed in Ireland's towns and cities. But I suppose we can't rest on our laurels. Our needs and expectations are fundamentally different now than they were in the 1950s. The rural water services sector enjoys the benefit of committed people who all have a common goal: to improve water supply and wastewater services in rural areas. So, we can't lose sight of that. There's a lot of very good people in the sector with a strong commitment to to deliver results. And this commitment, collaboration across all stakeholders will be needed to meet the remaining and evolving challenges in the sector in order to achieve parity with public water supplies and wastewater services. So don't forget, this is all about the people, and that's a good image there showing the types of commitment from the people in the sector, which underpin, I suppose, the good work that has taken place over the last 20, 30, 40 years. I'll just finish just with a word of thanks. Just the working group, I suppose, commissioned the study on behalf of the department. And while everybody, I suppose, was very, very supportive in the working group, I'd just like to single out two in particular. That's Barry Dean from the Federation and Luke Varley from the department, just who gave of their time very generously and gave great support in the work that we did. So hopefully I've kept to the time. We'll finish on that note. Thank you very much.